don't know if February is too late to talk about my best books of 2025. Hi, my name is Sharon, and here we talk about books of all different genres. I thought I'd do a video on my best books of last year because I'm still new to filming YouTube videos, and I feel like that's a good video to kind of sum up the kind of books I like. Honestly, I can't really decide on a ranking for my best books. I liked a lot of them equally, but I think I'll just do my top 3 and then everything else I'll put into different genres. Timestamps below in the description. My top 3 in no particular order. I can't rank them. I loved them all equally and they're all so different as well. Book 1, Atmosphere by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I saw this on a lot of other people's favourites for the year as well. You follow 2 women in the 80s who join NASA's space program, and they're kind of going to be the first women to go into space. Honestly, in the beginning I didn't really care for any of the space parts of the book, and then I was like, oh, is this going to be a TJR book that I don't really love? But then the more I read on, the more I grew attached to the characters, especially Joan, who you follow the most in the story. Taylor Jenkins Reid just writes relationships so well. This is a sapphic love story, and there's a really sweet relationship between Joan and her niece as well. This is a journey of identity, and I fall into the camp of people who cried at the end. Definitely one of my favourite TJR books of all time. Book 2, A Song to Drown Rivers by Liang. This is a historical fiction / fantasy. Although the fantasy is so minimal, it's basically not fantasy. This story is based on the legend of Shi, who is one of the 4 beauties of ancient China. She's this young, beautiful girl who gets recruited by a military advisor to spy for an enemy kingdom. She has to seduce the emperor and make him fall in love with her. This is a really beautiful, tragic, forbidden love story. Very high stakes, lots of yearning, gorgeous writing. I think Liang predominantly writes YA contemporary fiction, but I think this is so her calling. I hope Liang writes the stories on all the other 4 beauties and all the legends. I've also just seen that she's releasing a book in October, and that's going to be a historical fantasy as well, so I'm really excited. Book 3 is Another Life by Kristin. I think I've read pretty much all her most popular books by now, so I'm slowly making my way through the backlist through her other ones as well. I loved all the other ones like The Nightingale, The Great Alone. I think my favourite for a really long time was The Four Winds, but I think now this has overtaken as my favourite Kristin. In this story you have Lauren, who's a teenage girl living with her single mum. Her mum honestly is a terrible mum who doesn't really want to be a mother at all. They're going through money troubles, threats of being evicted from their flats, and her mum just really doesn't care. And then we have Angie, who's an older woman. She's splitting with her husband, so she moves back to her hometown to help out with her family business. Angie and Lauren's lives cross paths, and this is where a really sweet and special relationship begins. I love Kristin storytelling. She really knows how to make you feel for the characters. This was emotional and heartbreaking, but also heartwarming as well. The connection between my top 3 books is that they all made me cry. I love a sad, emotional book. So those are my top 3, and now I think I'll just split the rest into different categories. So for thrillers, I have quite a few favourites. I read over 100 thrillers and mysteries last year. I've only been reading thrillers for around a year and a bit, so I love how I went from basically not reading thrillers to being in Fable's top 1% of thriller readers. I read so many, and a lot of them usually are quite middle of the road, 3-star for me. I really liked Local Women Missing by Mary Kubica, where we have a girl who goes missing and then a mother and daughter who goes missing. There's dual timelines, different perspectives. Then when one of the girls turns up a decade later, everyone wants to know what happened to her. I also read so many thrillers last year about girls who went missing and girls held in captivity. Honestly, that's not my favourite type of thriller to read. These poor girls, it's always the girls who go missing. But this one was so fast paced, it had me on the edge of my seat. I binged this in a day. I also read and loved another Mary Kubica book, She's Not Sorry. Here we have an ICU nurse who's tending to a patient who's in a coma. They fell off a bridge and may or may not have been pushed on purpose. This was another dual timelines, multiple perspectives thriller, which Mary Kubica does really well. I've only read 2 of her books, but so far both have been 5 stars. Then we have The Pact by Sharon Bolton. Here you follow a group of privileged, reckless teenagers in school. Then one night they cause a fatal car accident. It was very much their fault, and they know they're not going to get away with this crime. So one of them in the group decides to take the fall for everyone else on the condition that when she gets out of prison, every single one of them in the group owes her a favour. I really loved the concept of this one. This was also really fast paced. I will say that the ending was a bit rushed. A lot happened in a short space of time, and the characters are also quite unlikable, but I really liked the plot twists and I had a really good time. Another thriller I really loved is No Exit by Taylor Adams. I feel like this is a quintessential winter thriller. I heard so many people talk about this before. You follow the main character Darby during a snowstorm, and she kind of gets stuck at this rest stop with a bunch of other strangers. When she's in the car park though, she discovers a van where a child has been locked in it. This child has been kidnapped, and Darby has to figure out basically who's the suspect, who owns this van. And of course she can't not save the child. This was a really gripping, twisty survival thriller, and it also feels really fast paced because basically everything happens in the span of a night. I also want to recommend a whole series that I really loved. It's the Joe Talbot series by Alan Eskens. I think there are only 3 books. If there's more, I've only read 3 of them. The Life We Bury, The Shadows We Hide, and The Stolen Hours. Joe Talbot is basically this aspiring reporter. In the first book for his school project, Joe decides to interview a dying convicted murderer who claims he is innocent. Whilst it starts off a bit slow, it does build up. You get to know the characters and you really get to know Joe and what he's going through in his home life. The writing was good. There's action, suspense, plot twists, and also I think the lengths of all the books are really good. They're not too short, but they're not too long either. I do think the third book, The Stolen Hours, is my favourite, but honestly I would recommend them all. And then last thriller I'm going to talk about is A Good Mother by Michelle Dunne. This is such an underrated thriller. I think Michelle Dunne in general is a quite underrated author. Here in this story you follow a young girl who's been unalived and found floating in a lake or a river, some kind of body of water. The mother of course is devastated, but she knows this wasn't an accident because her daughter is deeply afraid of water, so she knows her daughter would never go near that. You then follow the mother as she grapples with this loss and other perspectives like family, friends. This story was slow burn, but it was really nuanced. The characters are going through different things and there are lots of complex and toxic relationships and dynamics in here. And of course you're wondering the whole time, who was the culprit? I thought the plot twist was really good. I didn't see it coming, which to be honest I say that about nearly every plot twist. I never see any plot twist coming. This was such a good thriller, more people need to read this. Then I have a non-fiction, which is Tuesdays with Morrie by Mitch Albom. In this book, Mitch, the author, reconnects with his old professor called Morrie, and Morrie has actually been diagnosed with ALS. And then every week, Mitch goes to visit him and they just chat about life. As a dying man, Morrie just has a different perspective on life. He has so many words of wisdom. This book is of course sad, but also really profound. I think everyone would take away at least one thing that's meaningful in this book about the meaning of life. Honourable mention to The House of My Mother by Shari Franke. I didn't read many memoirs last year. In fact, I think this might have been the only one that I read, but this memoir was really impactful. Shari is the daughter of Ruby Franke, who had a family vlogging YouTube channel. I don't watch family vlogging channels, and I didn't know who Ruby Franke was until I saw her in the news when she was arrested. Shari tells her side of the story and the hardships of what it was like growing up in an abusive environment. A really sad story. Then for my general fiction section, Sylvia's Second Act by Hilary Albom. I did not expect to fall in love with this story as much as I did. We follow Sylvia, who's in her 60s and she's living in a retirement home with her husband, but one day she walks in on him cheating on her with someone else, and to make matters worse, he has also lost their entire life savings because of bad investments. She is understandably furious, but then also sees this as an opportunity to leave the retirement home since she wasn't loving it there anyway, and she moves back to Manhattan to make something of her life. This was pitched as like an older Sex and the City. This was such a fun, feel-good story. I love Sylvia. This book was hilarious, endearing, and it brought me so much joy, and I definitely recommend if you just want something feel-good. Last year was the year that I discovered Ellen Hildebrand. I started with The Hotel Nantucket, and the next thing you know, I read like 10 of her books. One of my favourites was The Identicals. I don't think this one is quite as popular as some of our other ones like The Hotel Nantucket and The 5-Star Weekend, but I really liked this one. You follow two identical twin sisters who are estranged. One lives on Martha's Vineyard and one lives on Nantucket. I'm really bad at remembering character names, but I think Tabitha is the one who lives on Nantucket, and she's a lot more polished and put together, and she owns a fancy clothing boutique. And Harper is the twin who's a lot more carefree. The two of them reconnect after over a decade of not talking to each other because their father dies, and they then have to deal with his estate. And then the two of them decide to swap lives. Not really in a parent trap way where they're trying to pretend to be each other, but they just decide to switch lives and help each other out with their different issues. This is a bit of slice of life, but just a really good character-driven family drama. I feel like Ellen Hildebrand books would make for really good TV shows. One of my other best books was another Ellen Hildebrand, and that was Golden Girl. Here you have a best-selling author who lives on Nantucket and she passes away because of a hit and run. She's then in the afterlife watching her family as they struggle and try to move on from her passing. And she gets these 3 nudges to kind of nudge and influence someone who she's watching. I really loved this magical realism aspect. And there's also a bit of a mystery element as they try to uncover who was the culprit of the hit and run. Another favourite was Margot's Got Money Troubles by Ruthie Thorpe. This story centres around Margot, who I think is either a teenager or she's like 20, but she becomes pregnant by her college professor. He doesn't want the baby, but Margot decides to keep it and become a single mum. She's very much not equipped to deal with raising a baby, but she decides, it's okay, I'll just start an OnlyFans to make money. Even though it's obviously a heavy subject matter being a single mum and having to struggle on your own, this was told in a quite humorous tone and the book is quite quirky. Margot is a really endearing character who you root for, and I think I loved this so much as well because the audiobook was narrated by Elle Fanning. Margot and the audiobook were just really charming. I have a historical fiction favourite, which is The Lotus Shoes by Jane Yang. This story is set in 19th century China and you follow a young servant girl who's been sold into a wealthy family. You also follow the daughter of this wealthy family and the two girls' friendship and rivalry through the years. A lot of this book was actually really infuriating. There's a lot of injustice that happens to the servant girl because of her place in society, but she's also a character you really root for. This book made me feel so many different emotions, but it was a really great story. Honourable mention also goes to The Frozen River by Ariel Lawhon, where you follow a midwife in the I think 1700s. There's also a bit of a mystery as well because there's an unalived body at the beginning of the story. The death is ruled as an accident, but the midwife is not convinced. And again, like with most historical fictions, some parts are just so infuriating and also lots of misogyny. I loved our main character and her resilience and determination. And then for my favourite romance books, The Love Wager by Lynn Painter. You follow the main guy and girl who start off with a one-night stand, but then they decide they're not really for each other and just want to be friends. They have this wager where they see who can find a partner first, but they also try to be each other's wingman, wingwoman. There's a few different tropes going on in here, including fake dating as well. This was a really fun, light-hearted one. I loved the chemistry and banter. It's the kind of romance that makes you kick your feet in the air, and sometimes that's just all I want, a romance where the conflict isn't too heavy and tragic. I also really loved Promise Me Sunshine by Cara Bastone. I know there are so many books that should get nominated for the Goodreads Choice Awards and don't, and I feel like this is one of them. You have the female main character who's struggling with grief after the loss of her best friend who passed away from cancer. She then meets and befriends the male main character who sees what she's going through and helps her through this hard period. This is a story about overcoming grief, and the romance was just really sweet. I am currently reading another Cara Bastone book called Ready or Not, and I'm not that far into it, but so far I'm liking that one as well. Honourable mention goes to Check and Mate by Ali Hazelwood, which is a YA romance. This is a story about two chess rivals, and honestly, I don't know how to play chess. I know nothing about chess, but I really liked this one. And now for the fantasy/romantasy category. Sunrise on the Reaping by Suzanne Collins, which is the prequel to the Hunger Games series. When I was younger, I read all the Hunger Games books and I watched all the films, but I actually wasn't obsessed with them or anything. I think I was too deep in my Vampire Diaries era. But after I read and watched The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, that's when I really started to appreciate the Hunger Games series as a whole and how it stood the test of time. This is Haymitch's long-awaited story, and you basically find out why Haymitch is the way he is in the Hunger Games. This book did break me, but I guess I feel better in knowing that Mockingjay ended the way it did. Last year was also the year that I discovered Cassandra Clare. I started with the Infernal Devices series, where you're in this world of shadow hunters who hunt demons, and this is set in the Victorian times. This is a trilogy, and I think my favourite book was the second book, which is Clockwork Prince. I don't read that much fantasy or romantasy, so honestly I'm not that critical when it comes to world building. But I did think the world building was very good in this book. Normally I don't care too much for the fantasy / action elements, and I'm kind of only here for the romance. This one has a love triangle and the romance is slow burn but so worth it. And because I loved this series so much, I then decided to pick up the Mortal Instruments series. This is obviously the original Shadowhunter series, and it's set in modern day New York. And I was a bit wary going into this, thinking that I'm not really a fan of urban fantasy except for maybe The Vampire Diaries. But I was wrong. I really liked this, and now I'm sad for my teenage self because I feel like my teenage self would have enjoyed this even more. I read the first 3 in this series, and I think there's 6 in total. Honestly, all 3 books have kind of blended into one, and I'm not sure which one I preferred the most, but I'm really enjoying the series as a whole. I feel like the majority of the books in Cassandra Clare's different series all seem to have the same name except for one word switched out, like City of Bones, City of Glass, City of whatever, and that just leads me to get confused when remembering which book is which. I'm very good at abandoning series and never finishing them, but I am going to try finish this series this year and read the rest of the 3 books. This is really fun and I'm enjoying the romance. Cassandra Clare's writing is really good, and I think she knows how to make a fantasy world immersive as well as really bingeable. And then the one and only book from last year, which I do have a physical copy of, is Alchemized by Sen-Lin Yu. I don't really buy physical books anymore because I don't actually read physical books. Alchemized was originally called Manacled, which is a Dramini fanfic. I read Manacled years ago and I really loved it. It was the best book I read of that year. And so when Alchemized came out, I had to buy myself a trophy copy. This is a special edition, which is actually from Germany, but it's an English edition. This is what it looks like under the dust jacket, and I can't not show it off because it's so pretty, and sprayed edges as well. This is a really dark fantasy, and I typically don't read dark romance or anything like that. In this fantasy world we have alchemists and necromancers. We follow our main character Helena, who's a healer and an alchemist. There's been a devastating war and the good guys lost. Now Helena is imprisoned and she's been given to this necromancer called Cain, and she's basically trapped and living on his estate. She's dealing with trauma, memory loss, her captivity. I will say I did think I preferred reading Manacled because that was my first time reading it. I don't think anything ever feels like the first time you read and love a book. And then for Alchemized, I listened to the audiobook. I didn't love the narration that much. I definitely preferred reading this physically. But I really did love the slow burn enemies to lovers in this, and I'm going to put it in my favourites anyway. So those are all my best books from last year. Let me know if you've read any of these or if any of these were your favourites. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in my next video.